Okay, so we all know Martin Luther, right? The guy who kind of flipped the whole religious world on its head.
Yeah, the Reformation, huge deal. But here's a question you might not have considered. What if Luther, in all his theological back and forth, actually ended up kind of being a philosopher too?
I mean, he did have some pretty strong opinions about philosophy, and not always in a good way.
Exactly. It's a pretty cool paradox. And for you, dear listener, if you're the type of person who loves those aha moments, who really enjoys digging deep and making those surprising connections, this is the deep dive for you.
We like to get into the nitty-gritty here, but without all the confusing jargon. It's about understanding, not just knowing a bunch of fancy words.
Precisely. And today we're tackling this fascinating question. How did Martin Luther, a figure we mainly associate with theology, end up shaping the landscape of philosophical thought for centuries? It's a wild ride.
And we're basing this entire deep dive on a super comprehensive source. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, wait for it, Luther's influence on philosophy.
It's a goldmine of information, meticulously tracing how Luther's ideas, even when they were being challenged or reinterpreted, became this crucial reference point for major philosophical movements and some of the most influential thinkers in history.
That's right. And our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to pull out the most important insights from all this rich historical and philosophical back and forth.
To see how Luther's theological convictions actually intersected with and ended up shaping philosophical discussions on, well, basically everything.
From the very nature of human reason to the very idea of freedom itself. So buckle up. All right, let's jump right in. Let's start with the early modern period. Now, at first glance, things seem a bit contradictory.
Right. You have Luther, a guy who's pretty much railing against philosophy, especially that old Greek dude, Aristotle.
He's all about faith, right? Faith above all else. So how on earth could someone with that kind of stance have a real impact on how philosophers actually thought?
That's the million-dollar question. And the tension you're pointing out is super important. It's amazing how a figure who seems so opposed to philosophical inquiry can actually become a central point of philosophical debate.
Almost in spite of himself, he's driving these arguments.
Yeah, almost. A great example of this is the Hoffman controversy at the University of Helmstedt back in 1598. This whole episode reveals a struggle that honestly is still relevant today.
When faith and reason clash, whose authority wins? Whose perspective gets to shape how we understand the world?
Huge questions. And this Hoffman guy, a theologian, he actually used Luther's critiques of philosophy, those criticisms, as a weapon to attack his own colleagues at the university.
No way. That's taking academic rivalry to a whole new level.
Right, talk about office politics. But he was serious. He was arguing that certain philosophical viewpoints went against Luther's theology and should just be tossed out.
Ouch. I bet that didn't go over well.
Not really. It sparked a massive backlash, especially from a guy named Duncan Little. And this whole thing blew up into a huge debate that raged throughout the 17th century.
About the whole relationship between theology and philosophy.
Yep. They were wrestling with some really fundamental questions. It even got into this super controversial idea of double truth.
Like something could be true in philosophy, but false in theology. Or the other way around.
Exactly. Talk about a mind-bending concept. And even heavy hitters like Pierre Bayle and Leibniz, they revisited this whole controversy years later, showing just how much staying power it had.
That's incredible. So Luther, without even really trying to be a philosopher, became this central figure in a massive philosophical brawl.
Right. It's a totally unexpected way to, as we said earlier, act as a philosopher.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about this whole thing with certainty, specifically religious certainty.
Luther was a huge champion of the authority of Scripture, right? Like that's the ultimate source of truth.
Exactly. Luther was convinced that Scripture offered a level of certainty that just wasn't there in all those pronouncements by the church hierarchy.
But here's the irony, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually points this out, this intense focus on the individual's interpretation of Scripture.
Ended up leading to all these new debates about skepticism.
It's like the opposite of what he intended.
It's pretty wild. Reformers and Catholics found themselves arguing over which interpretive method was better at avoiding those skeptical doubts. Some even started asking whether faith itself needed a bit of skepticism to really work.
Which is like the last thing Luther would have wanted.
Right. So in his quest for this rock-solid certainty, he accidentally opened up these new avenues for philosophical doubt, forcing thinkers to wrestle with the very foundations of knowledge.
So fascinating how the pursuit of unwavering faith can actually fuel philosophical questioning. Now, our source also highlights Luther's direct influence on some specific philosophers, and we're going to start with, get this, Thomas Hobbes.
Talk about an unlikely duo. A radical theologian and a materialist philosopher. Who would have thought?
So what's the connection there? What brings these two together?
Well, Hobbes, even though he had some pretty unconventional religious views himself, actually had a bit of admiration for what Luther did, challenging the Catholic Church during the Reformation.
Right, shaking things up. But the strongest link between them is in this epic debate Hobbes had with Bishop Bramhall.
About, drumroll please, free will.
Yeah.
This was a serious intellectual showdown.
I can imagine. Orchestrated, by the way, by none other than the Marquess of Newcastle.
Oh yeah, got to give him credit for setting the stage. And this whole debate unfolded through a series of books and pamphlets. Back in the day, that's how they battled it out.
So tell me, what was Bramhall's beef with Hobbes's ideas on liberty? What was he so against?
Bramhall was a hardcore defender of free will. He thought Hobbes's deterministic view of human action was, degrading. He said it dishonors the nature of man.
Like we're just puppets on strings, right? No control over our own destiny.
Exactly. He even had this great line said, Hobbes' philosophy makes humans into tennis balls of destiny, just being knocked around by forces beyond our control.
Okay, I love that image. And of course, there were huge theological implications too.
Big time. Bramhall argued that if everything is predetermined, if there's no free will, then God becomes the author of evil, the author of sin.
Which, from a theological standpoint, is a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. He thought it was blasphemous, even dangerous, like it could lead people towards atheism. So we're dealing with some massive philosophical and theological questions here.
Human agency, divine responsibility, the big stuff. So how did Hobbes, this materialist philosopher, all about the mechanics of the natural world, how did he respond to these serious religious objections?
This is where it gets really interesting. Hobbes, facing all this heat, did something pretty clever. He used the Reformation tradition, specifically Luther, as a kind of defense.
Like a shield.
Like a philosophical and theological shield. He said, look, Bramhall's criticisms of my determinism, they're basically the same arguments Erasmus used against Luther when Luther denied free will.
So he's drawing a parallel between these two debates, centuries apart.
Exactly. And then he pulls out this really key distinction that Luther made. The difference between the necessity of immutability and the necessity of constraint.
Okay, I'm going to need a bit of help with that one. Necessity of what now?
I know, right? It's a mouthful. But it's a crucial distinction. Luther argued that God's will is unchanging, like a fixed point.
Okay, that's immutability.
Right. And all events happen according to his divine plan, his foreknowledge. But, and here's the key, this doesn't necessarily mean that humans are forced, like against their will, to sin.
So that's constraint.
You got it. They still act based on their own internal desires, their motivations.
Even if those desires are ultimately part of God's bigger plan.
Exactly. It's a subtle distinction, but it's there. And Hobbes, he takes this distinction and runs with it. He argues that even if humans lack this ultimate libertarian free will.
Like the power to choose anything at all, regardless of our nature or God's plan.
Exactly. Even without that, they can still be held accountable for their actions because they're not being forced from the outside to do bad things.
So it's like God knowing you'll choose coffee doesn't mean someone's physically shoving a cup in your hand.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
You're still choosing it, even if you couldn't have chosen otherwise.
It's like they're acting willingly in a way, even if their will isn't ultimately free in the sense of being completely unconstrained.
That's a really great way to put it. And when Bramhall pushed back, asked why God wouldn't just make everyone good if he has the power to control their will, Hobbes went back to Luther again.
Double down on the Luther defense.
He said, look, you can't judge God's actions by human standards of fairness. It's a different playing field entirely. It's a bold move, right? Using a major figure of the Reformation to defend a seemingly deterministic philosophy against a whole bishop.
It's brilliant, even if a little sneaky. But, this brings up a point that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy makes, and it's something we have to consider. Can Hobbes's materialism, his focus on the mechanics of the natural world, can that really capture the essence of what Luther was talking about?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's a crucial tension to acknowledge. For Luther, rejecting free will wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was deeply spiritual. The idea that God has a plan, that he's chosen you, it brought comfort, certainty.
Took away the anxiety of thinking your salvation was all on you.
Exactly. But Hobbes's philosophy, rooted in those material causes and natural laws, it just doesn't have that spiritual depth. It's a different ballgame. Plus, Luther's arguments against free will, they weren't coming from this materialist view of human nature. They were rooted in his understanding of how the fall messed everything up, original sin and all that.
Like the human will is inherently flawed, either totally inclined towards good, which means there's no real choice because good is the only desirable option.
Or it's completely twisted towards evil, meaning it can't even choose true good.
It's heavy stuff, but it's a totally different starting point from Hobbes. So even though Hobbes found this useful tool, this conceptual distinction in Luther, their fundamental worldviews were miles apart.
It shows how philosophical arguments can sometimes borrow from theological ideas without actually buying into the whole package.
Now, the source also mentions a connection, a little less direct, between Luther and Hobbes's political philosophy.
Oh yeah, that's interesting too. Think about Hobbes' famous idea, homini lupus, man is a wolf to man.
In the state of nature, it's every man for himself.
Right, and that actually echoes Luther's pretty pessimistic view of humanity. We're inherently sinful, we need a strong hand to keep us in line.
Left to our own devices, we descend into chaos.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
So both thinkers, coming from different angles, end up arguing for a powerful state.
Because humans can't be trusted to govern themselves.
It's a tough stance, and it's been interpreted as potentially leading towards, authoritarianism.
The idea that we need a strong leader, maybe even an absolute ruler to maintain order.
Right, it's a slippery slope. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
This guy was a champion of ecumenism, right? Like bringing different Christian denominations together.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And a firm believer in the power of reason. So how does Luther, who sometimes seems pretty anti-reason, how does he fit into Leibniz's whole philosophical project?
It's another one of those surprising pairings.
It really is. But remember, Leibniz, even though he was all about reason and unity, he grew up Lutheran. It's part of his background, his intellectual DNA.
And he even mentions reading Luther's famous work, De Servo Arbitrio, on the bondage of the will early on in his life.
It's in there somewhere, shaping his thinking. And Leibniz, being the systematic guy he was, he also tackled the whole Hobbes-Bramhall free will debate.
Of course he did. Couldn't resist a good philosophical puzzle.
Right. He addressed it in his Theodicy, though a bit later than the original debate.
So what's his take? Does he side with Hobbes or Bramhall?
He's Leibniz, so of course he finds a middle ground. But he does point out that Hobbes was right about one thing.
Which is?
Luther did seem to endorse a view where God's foreknowledge basically meant that all future events are absolutely necessary.
So it's like a super strong version of determinism.
Right. But Leibniz, ever the diplomat, felt that maybe Luther went a bit too far.
Like maybe he didn't need to go that far to make his point.
Exactly. And to smooth things out, Leibniz brought in this classic distinction from scholastic philosophy, the difference between hypothetical necessity and logical necessity.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me.
No problem. He argued that God's perfect knowledge, the fact that he knows everything that will happen, creates a kind of hypothetical necessity.
Hypothetical meaning?
Meaning, given that God knows it will happen, then yeah, it's definitely going to happen.
It's certain, but...
But it's not logically necessary, meaning the opposite couldn't happen without creating a contradiction.
It's a bit like saying a square having four sides is hypothetically necessary, because that's how we define it. But it's not logically necessary because we can imagine shapes with other numbers of sides.
Exactly. We can think about it without breaking the rules of logic. And Leibniz is applying that same kind of nuanced thinking to the relationship between God's knowledge and our actions.
So we can affirm that God knows everything without having to say that everything is predetermined in a super rigid way.
Right. There's still room for contingency, for things to be otherwise. Very Leibnizian, finding that middle ground, that perfect balance.
Now, what about the age-old debate between faith and reason? Luther had some pretty strong opinions about that, and he wasn't always a fan of philosophy.
Oh yeah, he had some harsh words for those philosophers. But Leibniz, ever the peacemaker, tackled this issue head-on in his Theodicy.
What's his take?
He acknowledged Luther's criticisms, but he kind of put them in context. He said, look, Luther was mostly criticizing this very specific, very narrow kind of philosophy that was popular back then, a kind of scholasticism.
Which he thought just couldn't grasp the deeper mysteries of faith.
Exactly. And Leibniz even pointed out that later on, Luther softened his stance on Aristotle, the big name in ancient Greek philosophy.
So he's showing that Luther wasn't totally closed off to philosophy.
Right, there's nuance there. And Leibniz, to bridge the gap between faith and reason, He made this really important distinction. He separated what's above reason from what's contrary to reason.
Okay, so what's above reason?
It's those mysteries of faith, the things that our little human minds just can't fully grasp.
Like the Trinity or the Incarnation.
Exactly. But then there's what's contrary to reason, which are things that actually contradicts logic, things that just don't make sense.
So faith might involve things we can't fully understand, but it can't go against reason itself.
That was his main point. If something presented as faith is totally absurd, then reason has every right to reject it. This distinction was key for Leibniz.
He wanted to find a way to bring faith and reason together.
He was all about that harmony, finding that middle ground. And this even extended to one of the most controversial topics of the Reformation, the Eucharist.
The nature of the bread and wine, right?
Yeah.
Huge disagreement between Catholics and Protestants.
Massive debate.
Huh.
And Leibniz, always the unifier, thought his own philosophy could help solve this seemingly impossible problem.
So how does his philosophy fit into this whole debate?
It's really interesting. The source points out that Leibniz's metaphysics, his ideas about substance and form, they actually align more with the Lutheran view of the Eucharist.
The real presence, right, as opposed to the Catholic transubstantiation.
Exactly. So even his core philosophical system had these subtle echoes of Lutheran theology. It's really remarkable.
It's amazing how Luther's initial theological positions, even his criticisms of philosophy, led to all these intricate and varied philosophical discussions in the early modern period.
It's like he set off this chain reaction of thought.
And these thinkers, they had to figure out where they stood in relation to his legacy. Okay, let's move on to the 18th and 19th centuries, to Kant and the post-Kantians.
Another fascinating chapter in this ongoing story.
How does Luther's influence show up in this new era of German philosophy?
Things get even more interesting with German idealism. Now, Kant himself wasn't raised in mainstream Lutheranism. He was part of the Pietist movement.
Pietism, that was a reform movement within Lutheranism, right?
Exactly. They wanted to go back to the roots, to the original spirit of Luther's teachings. And they were really focused on the limits of human reason when it comes to faith.
And on the idea that humans are inherently flawed in need of some serious spiritual renewal?
You got it. And this Pietist background, with its roots in Luther, it most likely had a big impact on Kant's philosophical work.
Especially his exploration of what we can and can't know, the boundaries of human understanding.
Right. Kant constantly emphasized the limits of reason, what some scholars call the weakness motif.
Like, reason has its place, but it can only take us so far.
Exactly. And that resonates with a core idea in Lutheranism, human frailty, the potential for pride to lead us away from true faith.
We're not as smart as we think we are.
Pretty much. And then there's Kant's famous line that he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith.
Like, reason can't prove or disprove the existence of God, so we have to make a leap of faith.
Right. And he was really critical of those traditional philosophical proofs for God's existence. All of this echoes some key Lutheran themes.
Faith is a gift, not something you earn through logic.
That's the idea. Even Kant's view of human nature, which was pretty pessimistic, connects to the whole Augustinian and Lutheran understanding of original sin.
We're born messed up, inclined towards evil.
And even the form of Kant's moral law, the categorical imperative with its emphasis on duty, could be seen as reflecting this Lutheran idea about the purpose of law.
To restrain our evil impulses and point us towards something higher that we can't achieve on our own.
Exactly. It's like the law's there because we need it, because we can't be trusted to always do the right thing.
But even with all these parallels, our source makes it clear that Kant ends up diverging from some key aspects of Luther's thought.
He definitely forges his own path. He might be inspired by Luther, but he's not afraid to disagree.
So where does he break away from Luther?
Well, even though he acknowledged the limits of reason in matters of faith, he still thought philosophy was its own thing, with its own rules.
It's not subservient to theology. They're separate domains.
Right. And he developed his own really influential concept of free choice, what he called Willkür.
Which is different from Luther's view in the bondage of the will.
Very different. And Kant famously argued that ought implies can.
Meaning, if we have a moral obligation to do something, we must have the ability to do it.
Which clashes directly with Luther's emphasis on our dependence on God's grace.
We can't do good on our own. We need God's help.
That's the Lutheran view.
Yeah.
And Kant actually rejected the traditional concept of grace because he thought it undermined the whole idea of moral responsibility.
If we're not ultimately responsible for our actions, how can we be held accountable for them?
That was his concern. So, yeah, you see echoes of Luther and Kant, but he ultimately builds a philosophical system that goes beyond and even contradicts some core Lutheran ideas.
Okay, let's talk about Hegel now. His take on Luther seems totally different from Kant's.
It's a complete 180. While Kant rarely mentions Luther directly and keeps a bit of a distance, Hegel openly praises him, sees him as this key figure in the development of Western thought.
Like a turning point in history.
Exactly. And even though Hegel had his own issues with his Lutheran education, later in his life he actually declared himself a convinced Lutheran.
But like through his own philosophical lens, of course.
Of course. He was still Hegel after all.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how they flipped what they found important in Luther.
Kant focused on those limitations of reason that resonated with Lutheran pessimism.
Right. But Hegel, who was much more optimistic about reason, he found common ground with Luther's views on freedom and authority.
So they both saw something valuable in Luther, but from opposite ends of the spectrum.
It's fascinating. And another thing they both agreed on, even though they got there in different ways, was the idea that philosophy shouldn't be under the thumb of theology.
They both thought philosophy has its own rightful place, its own autonomy.
Absolutely. Now, to understand how Hegel viewed Luther, you have to look at some of his key texts, his lectures on the philosophy of religion, history, and even the history of philosophy.
He wove Luther into his whole grand narrative of history.
He did. For Hegel, Luther was the guy who ushered in this new era of internality, individuality, what he famously called Christian freedom.
The Reformation was this turning point where religion shifted from outward rituals to inward experience.
From focusing on the hierarchy of the church to focusing on the individual's direct relationship with God.
A very modern idea in a way.
Definitely. And Hegel actually saw his own ambitious philosophical project as a kind of continuation of what Luther started.
Like a second Reformation, but in the realm of philosophy and politics.
Exactly. He even connected the two in the preface to his philosophy of Räse. And other thinkers like Heinrich Heine, they picked up on this too.
In his book on the history of religion and philosophy in Germany, he presented this idea of Luther as a quintessentially German figure who paved the way for German idealism.
It's a powerful narrative. And to really understand how Hegel connected Luther to this idea of freedom, you have to look at four key aspects.
Okay, lay them on me.
First, Hegel saw Christian freedom as this process of finding yourself in the other.
Which connects to Luther's idea of God as not some distant, angry judge, but a more present, forgiving presence.
Exactly. Second, Hegel emphasized the importance of surrendering yourself, your individual ego, to achieve true understanding.
Like letting go of your preconceptions and biases to see the bigger picture.
Right. And some scholars have seen this reflected in Hegel's own philosophical method, this kind of intellectual humility.
Letting the ideas unfold organically, almost like a process of self-discovery.
That's a great way to put it. Third, Hegel adopted that classic Pauline and Lutheran view that true Christians, the ones who have been liberated by grace, don't need external laws to guide their actions.
They're motivated by love, not fear of punishment.
And this idea resonates with some of Hegel's earlier writings, where he expressed a preference for love over strict legalism.
Like love is a more powerful motivator than fear.
Absolutely. And finally, Luther's critique of free will and the bondage of the will, that resonated deeply with Hegel's own critique of Willkür, the idea of arbitrary choice.
And he tried to reconcile freedom and necessity in his own philosophical system.
A very Hegelian thing to do. So even though Hegel was a champion of reason, you can still see how Luther's theological ideas, those basic building blocks, continue to shape his thinking.
He built upon them, transformed them, but they're still there in the background.
It's remarkable. And just to round things out, let's touch briefly on Fichte and Schelling, the other big names in German idealism.
Did they engage with Luther as well?
They did, but in their own unique ways. Fichte mainly saw Luther as this important national figure, a symbol of German identity and freedom.
He even talked about him in his addresses to the German nation, right?
Exactly. And he praised Luther's contribution to the German language through his translation of the Bible.
A massive undertaking, that translation.
It was. But Fichte was also critical of Luther's insistence on Scripture alone as the source of religious authority.
Sola Scriptura, that was the sticking point for Fichte.
He thought reason had a bigger role to play. But there might also be a connection, a bit less direct, between Luther's ideas and Fichte's concept of recognition.
The idea that our sense of self comes from being recognized by others.
Right, a very important idea in social and political philosophy. Now, Schelling, he actually directly referenced Luther's bondage of the will in his own work.
Specifically in his philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom.
Yep. He used Luther's arguments to make a distinction between being forced to do something and acting out of inner necessity.
Two very different things.
Exactly. And he was trying to debunk this idea of a perfectly balanced will, the equilibrium arbitrari that some philosophers talked about,
Like, our will is somehow perfectly free to choose between options.
which Schelling and Luther would reject.
Now, some scholars even argue that Schelling, later in his life, became even more aligned with Lutheran theology than Hegel.
Because of his emphasis on the role of revelation in understanding truth.
It's fascinating how this 16th century figure continued to inspire and challenge so many different philosophers across centuries.
It's mind-blowing. Okay, now let's move on to two absolute giants of the 19th century, Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche.
Talk about a contrast in styles.
Oh, yeah, but they both engaged with Luther in really profound ways, even though they came at it from completely different perspectives. Kierkegaard, a deeply religious thinker, he was trying to revitalize what he saw as this stagnant, complacent Christianity.
Especially within his own denomination, the Danish Lutheran Church.
Right, he had some serious issues with the way things were going. But even though he was critical of the church, he had a lot of admiration for Luther himself.
He even saw himself as a kind of true heir to Luther.
But with a twist. He thought some of Luther's ideas had led to problems and needed to be rethought.
Like a corrective to the corrective, as he put it.
Exactly. He wanted to make sure people weren't just using Luther as an excuse to avoid actually living a Christian life. He famously said he wanted to prevent people from taking Luther in vain.
And he did this even though he wasn't a systematic reader of Luther's works.
He engaged with those ideas in his own unique way. Now, one thing Kierkegaard really struggled with was the whole idea of justification by grace alone.
Sola gratia, that core Lutheran doctrine.
Right. He agreed with it in principle, but he worried that people were using it as an excuse to be lazy, ethically and spiritually.
Like, I'm saved by grace, so it doesn't matter what I do.
That kind of attitude. He was afraid people were using grace to avoid actually doing good works. He even said, people plunge into the abyss of grace and think they're swimming.
They're just floating along, not actually striving for anything.
That was his concern. Now, he did admire those intense spiritual struggles, the Anfechtungen, that Luther went through.
But he felt his contemporaries lacked that same level of seriousness.
They weren't wrestling with those big questions of faith and existence. And for Kierkegaard, genuine faith was all about connecting with God through loving your neighbor.
Putting faith into action, not just keeping it in your head.
Absolutely. And he re-emphasized the importance of doing good, of following the example of Christ.
Imitatio Christi, that was his remedy for complacency.
And he criticized Luther for letting the Reformation become too political.
Like, it got caught up in power struggles and social structures.
Right. Kierkegaard thought that diluted the radical individualistic message of Christianity. He had a much more radical view of how faith should relate to the world.
It's not about fitting in, it's about challenging the status quo.
And he even preferred the monastic life, withdrawing from the world to the life of a typical Lutheran pastor.
Too comfortable, too bourgeois.
Not radical enough. Now, on the question of faith and reason, Kierkegaard was reacting against all that Hegelian rationalism that was dominant at the time.
Hegel was all about reason, the unfolding of spirit through history.
And Kierkegaard, he pushed back hard. He emphasized the paradoxical nature of Christian faith.
Like the idea that God became human in Christ. That's a paradox.
It defies logic, but that's what makes it so powerful. And he saw this emphasis on paradox in Luther's theology of the cross.
The idea that true strength comes through weakness, that God's power is revealed in suffering.
And Kierkegaard thought that demanded a leap of faith, a willingness to embrace risk, just like Abraham did.
When God asked him to sacrifice his son.
It's a terrifying story, but it illustrates the kind of radical faith Kierkegaard was talking about. And like Leibniz, he didn't think faith was contrary to reason, just that it operated on a higher level, a level that reason couldn't fully grasp.
Okay, let's talk about Nietzsche now. His perspective on Luther was bound to be pretty different.
Understatement of the century. Nietzsche was, Nietzsche. But even his view of Luther evolved over time. At first, he saw him as this rebellious figure, someone who challenged authority.
Like a proto-Nietzschean, maybe?
Yeah, maybe, a little bit. But after 1876, his view became much more negative.
What happened?
He started seeing Luther as representing this kind of resentful, weak type of person.
Someone who hated himself and projected that hatred onto God.
Instead of embracing his own strength and will to power, he turned to a vengeful God for comfort.
It's a pretty harsh assessment.
It is. But even though he rejected Luther's whole theological framework, some scholars think there might be a subtle connection between Luther's doubts about free will and Nietzsche's own rejection of it.
It's like they both saw free will as this illusion, this comforting story we tell ourselves.
Right. And Luther's critique of Erasmus's concept of a pure will, a will that's somehow separate from our desires and inclinations, that might have resonated with Nietzsche.
Nietzsche also criticized this idea of separating action from the person, the will from its embodiment.
It's a fascinating possibility, even if it's indirect. So even in his rejection, Nietzsche might have been influenced by Luther in a very specific way.
It's like Luther's ideas, they just kept rippling outwards, touching thinkers in the most unexpected ways. Okay, let's move on to Feuerbach and the Marxist tradition,
Another fascinating chapter in this story.
and another critical perspective on Luther's legacy.
For sure. Now, Luther plays a huge role in Feuerbach's work, especially in the second edition of The Essence of Christianity, and in his book specifically about Luther, The Essence of Faith. According to Luther,
Feuerbach was really interested in Luther, wasn't he?
oh yeah, he wanted to show that his whole analysis of religion, the idea that religion is just a projection of human desires and qualities onto God.
We create God in our own image.
That's the basic idea. He wanted to show that this applied just as much to Protestantism and Luther as it did to Catholicism.
It's not just a Catholic thing, it's a human thing.
Exactly. And Feuerbach had this really provocative interpretation of Luther's.